Welcome to Storytime with Angel. Today we're going to have an excerpt from an anthology that I just recently read that has some really great stories in it. This is the third volume of Gothica anthologies that Dreamspinner Press puts out. These stories are themed stories around a particular horror theme. Not all of the stories are terribly horrific, but the idea, I think, is to return more to traditional horror themes. So the first anthology was actually called Stitch, which was a really cool anthology. I highly recommend it. In which each of the authors took a look at different stories about created human beings. So there's a golem, and there's certain people who have been put together in different ways. Sort of like Frankenstein's monster, obviously, is the idea. So that was the first one. The second anthology is called Bones, and that is a voodoo story anthology. And this third one is called Claw, and this is built around the idea of the traditional werewolf story. We're so used to seeing in the gay romance community these days these shifter stories, pack stories. So when people say werewolf, they're automatically thinking of these pack stories. But these stories go back to an older tradition of werewolf stories, where the werewolf is an isolated individual. It's a very different feel to these stories. So let's take a quick look here. Today's excerpt is from Jamie Fessenden's Jamie Fessenden's story. The Gothica Volume 3, the Claw anthology, we have a blurb here that says, "Beasts lurk in the shadows of wild and forgotten places, and in the hearts and souls of men. They are the stuff of dreams and nightmares, but are they feral and savage, or just misunderstood? Creatures of myth and legend stalk these tales of desire and animal passions. 3 men come face to face with such creatures and find they are much more than they seem. While there is danger, there might be unexpected benefits as well, if they can accept the impossible and dare to venture into the primordial regions where nature and the beasts still reign." 3 acclaimed authors of gay romance explore the boundaries between man and beast and the place where their worlds overlap. It's very exciting stuff. All right, so Jamie's story is called Isolation, and the individual blurb for that reads, "When Sean's marriage breaks up, he returns to his hometown, hoping to find the childhood friend who meant everything to him in his teens. He finds Jack living in a cabin, surrounded by the forest he always loved, and the two begin to tentatively repair their damaged relationship. But a large animal has been seen prowling around the edge of town, and soon Sean comes face to face with the beast. Jack insists the creature isn't dangerous. It's been coming around the cabin for years. It isn't long, however, before Sean discovers a far more disturbing connection between his friend and the beast." All right, so this is called Isolation. This is from the Claw anthology at Dreamspinner Press. We'll have the buy links and everything below. And this is our excerpt from Isolation. Sean spent a boring day at the cabin by himself while Jack did a bunch of jobs in town. He scrounged up some lunch and went skinny dipping again, but it wasn't much fun without Jack. He jerked off this time, but that didn't take long. He didn't have much interest in reading, so he didn't even bother looking at the bookcase. He thumbed through the music on his iPhone, pretty much the only thing it was good for this far off the grid, but he couldn't find anything he was interested in listening to. He thought about driving into town, but the gas in his tank was so low he wasn't sure he'd make it. He'd have to ask Jack later if he could have a gas can, or could make a gas station run for him. Anyway, he'd grown up in Dunkirk. It wasn't much more interesting than the cabin was. Finally, in an act of desperation, he split wood. Jack had a bunch of cut-up logs piled up behind the cabin next to a woodpile covered with a tarp. Sean hadn't used a maul in years, but it came back to him quickly enough. And it gave him a way to pass the time and work off some of his frustration with the way things had been going. He understood why Jack was hesitant to let him back into his life, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. He couldn't stay there forever, mooching off Jack's food, but he was afraid to leave again without resolving things between them. He couldn't escape the feeling he wouldn't get another shot at it. Jack pulled in just as it was getting dark, and a beautiful crescent moon was rising above the pines. Sean was ecstatic to see him, even more so when Jack carried a large pizza and a 12-pack up onto the porch. They spent another pleasant evening together, shooting the shit until mosquitoes drove them inside. They'd dirty a couple of plates eating the pizza, so Jack washed those in the sink. While he was doing that, Sean drifted back to the small bookcase. He'd glanced at it earlier, but hadn't seen anything interesting, mostly horror novels. Now he noticed something he hadn't before. A lot of them were about werewolves. Like more than half. And they weren't all novels either. A lot of them seemed to be books about werewolves, with titles like Werewolves in Western Culture, A Lycanthropy Reader, and The Book of Werewolves, being an account of a terrible superstition. There were also a bunch of dolls and figurines of the Lon Chaney Wolfman and wolves in general. "What is all this shit you're reading?" he asked, picking up a book called The Werewolf by Montague Summers and flipping it open to see a bunch of entries in the table of contents like The Werewolf, His Science and Practice. Jack glanced over and then took the time to dry his hands on the dish towel before replying, "I like horror. Especially werewolves. You've got 3 shelves on them." Jack came close to him and peered over his shoulder at the book. They were both shirtless thanks to the muggy summer evening, and Sean was intensely aware of the heat coming off Jack's skin and the mingling of their sweat as his chest brushed Sean's shoulder. He could feel a soft puff of breath against his neck when Jack spoke. "When I was a kid, I used to think it would be so awesome to be a werewolf, running free in the forest." He chuckled, low and sultry. "Naked, far away from people." This was a childhood fantasy Sean had never been informed of. At least all the stuff about werewolves. He'd always known Jack had an affinity of the forest, even before that odd night of the whispering. They'd spent a lot of time camping together in a little pup tent Jack's father had given him for his 11th birthday. During the summers, they'd practically lived in the woods. Jack had seemed to belong there, and he'd talked about going off into the forest to live someday. Sean hadn't been quite so enthusiastic about the idea, but he'd always felt he belonged with Jack, wherever that might be, until he'd panicked and run away. "Well, you figured out the far away from people part at any rate," Sean said with an awkward laugh, closing the book and slipping it back onto the shelf. Jack wandered away and flopped down onto the couch, putting his feet up on the oak chest. "Not far enough when it comes to Mrs. Westcott and her goddamn flower bed. Bring me another beer, will you?" "Yes, master." They'd stashed the remaining few beers from the 12-pack in the fridge, so Sean grabbed a couple of those and brought them over to the couch. He handed one to Jack and flopped down on the couch beside him. "You were social enough when we were teenagers." "Since when?" "You were social. Sometimes. You went to parties, and I went to parties because I was hanging out with you. But I always hated them." Sean knew that was true. They'd both always preferred to be alone. He just never thought of it that way because they'd always been alone. Together. Now Jack seemed to have forgotten the together part. It occurred to him for the first time that Jack really might not want him there at all. Maybe he just barreled in and set up house without noticing how uncomfortable Jack was with the idea. "Am I making a pest of myself?" he asked. "Would you rather I stayed with my sister?" He braced himself for the answer. Jack paused, his beer halfway to his lips. "Where did that come from?" I just thought I kind of showed up on your doorstep and expected you to take me in. Maybe you're feeling put on the spot." "Are you drunk?" "No," Sean said, frustrated. "I'm just asking." Jack snorted and took a swig from his bottle. Then he carefully lowered it to his lap before responding, "You can be a little pushy at times." "So I am being a pest, then?" "You're not being a pest," Jack grinned. "Or maybe I should say you're always a pest, but I don't mind, really. It's just the way you are." That didn't exactly sound flattering, but Sean had asked, so he wouldn't piss and moan if that's how Jack felt about him. Would you like me to go stay with Julie? Jack appeared to think about it for a good long time. Then he rubbed his chin with one hand and said, I don't think that's really what I want. Then why am I sleeping on the couch? Jack gave him a long, hard look, then directly in the eye. Then he sighed and stood up. Look, what happened when we were teenagers, we were different people back then. Don't you get it? We can't just pick up where we left off. You told your father you were gay, Sean pointed out. What does that have to do with anything? I'm just saying. What happened between us wasn't just kids fooling around, Sean said. You're gay, and so am I. It took me a while to realize it. The fact that we're both gay doesn't mean we were meant for each other. No, Sean conceded, but we were meant for each other. You know it as much as I do. I know I hurt you by what I did. You did. Jack looked Sean directly in the eye. You have no fucking idea. For a moment, Sean saw so much pain reflected in those smoky hazel eyes that he was forced to look away, and in doing so, he knew he'd failed yet again. Jack finished off his beer and got up to go rinse his bottle in the sink. I'm sorry, Sean said quietly. I know. And I forgive you, really, but it doesn't matter. Jack set the bottle down on the counter and walked to his bedroom door. He turned in the doorway and spread his hands in a gesture of futility. It's too late to fix it, Sean. Then he went into the bedroom and closed the door. Sean heard the bolt latch. Alrighty. That is from Isolation by Jamie Fessenden in the Claw anthology, which is the third Gothic anthology from Dreamspinner Press. Kim Fielding also has a story in this anthology, as well as Eli Easton. They are all fabulous stories. I do very much recommend this anthology, especially if you're an old-time horror fan like I am. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.